Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. So, we are on to the next part of the story of Esther. We've heard already over the previous weeks, Mike brought to us a talk all about the hidden hand of God. God isn't mentioned here, and yet we see him at work in and through the whole story. And we'll see a little bit of that again today. And last week we heard from Beth talking about one of the most famous verses, the verse probably everyone knows when we think about Esther. About maybe for such a time as this, you were put in royal position. And Esther replies, if I perish, I perish. And how we're called to be dangerous people for God. Really exciting stuff. And this week, it's no different. There's so much to get from this passage, a lot to get through in a short space of time. We'll only be scratching the surface, really. But the focus of the story shifts at this point. This is kind of where we see the story build up to a real climax, and then we see the turning point and all the resolutions and conclusions start to work themselves out. But the focus also changes in character as well. We've had kind of a focus on Xerxes, the king, this egotistical maniac that he is, and we have a focus on Esther and Mordecai, and now the focus is on Haman, our antagonist of the story. And it was strange, in preparation for kind of bringing you a talk this morning, I had different songs running through my head. You're So Vain was one that came through. Can't Get No Satisfaction, Rolling Stones, that was another one. And It's All About You, which I think is busted. I can't remember, but it was something a little bit less classy than the others. Anyway, but we have this focus that comes onto our antagonist Haman throughout this small passage. And, it really fits his character because for him, it is all about him. The kind of theme for today is a different verse, the kind of stimulus, if you like, for the preparation. And it comes from Proverbs 3, verse 34. And it says this, he mocks, as in God, he mocks proud mockers, but gives grace to the humble. He mocks proud mockers, but gives grace to the humble. And throughout this passage, we see that Haman is the perfect example of what pride looks like, of how pride can destroy. And similarly, if we can grasp what pride looks like, we can have a much better understanding of what humility looks like as well. So to start with, the question I have for you, are you a person of pride or are you a person of humility? Are you a person of pride or are you a person of humility? And I'm not asking you that question to condemn, far from it. It's more as we go through this to get you thinking, okay, what does pride actually look like? Because maybe we're all starting from different places or different understandings of what pride is. And what does pride look like in me? Where have I seen pride at its worst in my life? And hopefully by the end of today, we'll have a better understanding of why it can be so destructive, but also how we, with God's help, can become a more humble people and why it's so important. So, what is pride? Haman, the perfect definition of pride. So, as we've just heard in that wonderfully narrated story, there are kind of three main parts in this passage that we've heard. The first part is where we see Haman. He is uplifted and honored, and we see that in the beginning in chapter 3, and we see it kind of as he becomes the focus at the beginning of chapter 5. We see again, he passes this Jew Mordecai, and Mordecai is the one that is the lowly one, the kind of, repulsed one, if you like. And so Haman is up, Mordecai's down, and then we get to chapter 6, and then we see this turning point, and again, the hidden hand of God. And beyond that, then it leads to Mordecai being raised, and Haman being put low, if you like. And so there's these three clear parts in this narrative. And again, by the end, we have a much better definition of what pride is, and thanks to Mordecai, what humility is. So let's get stuck in. So chapter 5, verse 9. So we see this moment where Haman comes out, and he sees Mordecai at the king's gate again, and he will neither bow nor show respect or fear to Haman. And again, that song came into my head, It's All About You. And the thing is, he goes home and he boasts to all his friends. He boasts of his power. He boasts of his wealth. He boasts of the fear that people have in him. And yet, he can't get any satisfaction, even though he is second only to the king. The whole world at his feet, responding to him with fear and adoration. And yet this one person causes all that to tumble. And I was reminded, there's this kind of famous banking family in the States called the Rockefellers. And one of the founders of the Rockefeller Bank, he was interviewed at one point, and one of the interviewers said to him, "Can I ask you, how much money is enough money?" Bear in mind, he was probably one of the wealthiest people in America at the time. How much money is enough money? And his response was, "Just a little bit more." And that kind of epitomizes Haman's position in terms of what he understands about power, wealth, and people fearing him. He has just about everything, and yet there's just one out of the thousands that chooses to not see him that way. And that means it's not enough. And it's interesting because the kind of thing at play behind all of that, behind his behavior, there's kind of an underlying insecurity. I want to be seen. I want to be known. I want to be feared. And Mordecai's response undermines that. Mordecai isn't going to play ball with seeing him and knowing him and fearing him as Haman desires to be seen, known, and feared. Similar to Xerxes, Haman is almost putting himself in a position like a god. And he wants people to respond to him in that way. Now, it can be quite easy from an outside perspective to look at Mordecai's response and think, well, maybe there's an element of pride there as well. I'm not going to bow down to you. Who are you to ask me to do that? There can be this kind of perspective, but let's park that for the moment and come back to it, because actually Mordecai's response is very cool for a number of reasons, but we will come back to it. So, why is Mordecai's response an issue for Haman, like it is, being the one person out of the thousands? Well, because pride, when it is in us and through us, pride will always ask us one question. Now, it might be a little bit more complicated than this, but this is a really great starting point for trying to identify if pride is in us. And the question that pride asks us is this: what does the world think of you right now? What does the world think of you right now? And it's a really antagonistic question, because despite all the thousands that basically are worshipping Haman to some degree, there's one man that will not see him as he needs to be seen to feel vindicated or validated. So pride pokes a stick at him. How does the world see you? That's how the world sees you. Like you're not seen, not known, not feared. How are you going to be validated? How are you going to be vindicated? And so this is where this kind of rage of Haman comes from, this constant questioning of how does the world see you? Are you enough for the world? And so this boasting and this kind of reticence towards Mordecai only becomes worse and worse and worse. And I think that was my phone. Oh, sorry about that. So, I should have turned it off, nightmare. So, do you know that although sometimes we think about pride, it can be very easy to assume that pride is all about prestige and all about being seen in the world and having achieved enough. I can have pride in that and pride in myself. But pride isn't just about that. And that's why this question, what does the world think of you right now, is really, really helpful. Because I had a moment way back in the first lockdown that really, really challenged me, and God really spoke to me through it. And I know now, looking back on it retrospectively, that actually I had pride in my life at that moment. But I didn't realize it quite at the time. You see, there was a point in the first lockdown, and I have no doubt many of you may have experienced something similar, because the first lockdown was 12 weeks, or however many weeks, 13, 14 weeks, I can't remember. But it was a long, sustained period that was tough for all of us, really tough. And there was a point, actually, I remember it, when actually I felt one day, maybe a couple of days, I was actually quite lonely. And loneliness is something that I've no doubt we've all experienced at one point or another. Now, I had many opportunities of where I could have spoken about it, or I don't know, whatever. But I didn't. I just kind of rode it out, as you do, British, stiff upper lip. That's how we kind of work in this society and culture. And yet, I remember someone, well, I'm not going to name names, but someone was checking in on me at one point, a few days afterwards. And they said to me, "How are you doing?" Or "How have you been this week?" I can't remember how they said it. And at that moment, kind of let my guard down. And I remember saying to them, I had a couple of days where I felt a little bit lonely. And their response was, what? Why didn't you tell me? And I sat there, and my response was something like, right? Because basically, I didn't have an answer, or I didn't have a good answer, to be honest. And the question is, I had a behavior of actually riding it out, not kind of telling anyone or seeking help or kind of company or whatever in the circumstance that we were in. But there is something behind, every behavior has something behind it. And the thing behind my behavior at that point was this question being spoken over me. What would the world think of you if you admitted that you were lonely at that point? What would people around you think of you, that you weren't strong enough or weren't coping or weren't this, that, or the other? And so straight away, there's pride there. I don't want to be seen to be less than what people think of me. So, and yet that was me kind of, I wasn't thinking about achievement or prestige or any of these things, and yet pride still took a hold of me in that moment. And funnily enough, there was, I can't remember, a following time, like a couple of weeks down the way, had a similar feeling, and it was one of those what I begrudgingly thought, I should probably drop that person a phone call. It was one of those, I don't even think I did it out of humility, I did it out of stubbornness, because I thought, nope, this isn't getting the better of me, I will give this person a call. And you know, as stupid as that sounds, it was great, and it was just what I needed. And it's interesting because we think about loneliness, that's one example, but we think about it as something of, I can't let people know about that. Actually, God has given us the capacity to feel that because it makes us aware that there is something that we need that is missing. In that case, it's connection. Now, it's not just with that, it could be with many things, but the point is, in those moments where we feel weak, actually pride is the thing that is destructive to being connected or experiencing fullness of life that God has in store for us. So pride can take kind of many forms, but the question behind everything is, what would the world think of you right now if you let that show? So as we move on through the story, we kind of, again, the turning point comes in chapter 6. And we see the king, this sleepless night, and we again kind of see a parallel alongside Haman as well, because he has this sleepless night, this hidden hand of God. What a coincidence that the one time Mordecai is going to need saving, the king has a sleepless night, and he says, bring me the annals, the histories of my kingdom, that I may hear them. I mean, that is also very vain. We were discussing that beforehand. Like, it's ironic that God uses that man's egotistical vanity to save a nation. But nonetheless, it was obviously needed. And the hidden hand of God shows itself once again. And then it comes to Mordecai. And this moment where Haman, the focal point of the narrative, he's kind of planning and prepping and devising schemes to get Mordecai hanged. And yet the king brings him forward and says, who should I honor? Or what should I do for someone that I honor? The king delights to honor. And Haman says, well, he can't possibly want to honor anyone but me. Again, this vanity, this, how do people see me, know me, and fear me? Surely it's for me. And he says, give him a king's robe, king's horse. And yet, it all turns out quite poorly for Haman. Mordecai is raised up, and Haman is put low. And let's just rewind for a second, because if you remember, going back to Esther chapter 5, verse 9, where we saw that Mordecai would not bow. He would not show fear to Haman. And again, this could easily be perceived as pride. But as we'll see, it isn't, because the world and Haman, they might say, who do you think you are? That might be how it comes across. You're not better than me. This kind of issue of how does the world see me? But the reality for Mordecai is he's asking, or is being asked, a different question to Haman. The question behind his behavior is this: what does God think of me right now? What would God think of me right now? And they result in two different outcomes. Because unlike Haman, who needs to be seen, needs to be known, needs to be feared to be validated, Mordecai knows that God sees him and that God knows him. And for him, that is enough. And you might think, well, yeah, but once he's kind of got a taste of the glory, once he's got a taste of that prestige, he's got the king's robe on him, he's been paraded around by Haman, this person who's kind of been his kind of nemesis for the whole narrative. I mean, surely that's a great opportunity to lord it over him, to kind of rub salt in the wound, to kind of be, well, okay, maybe I can get a bit of power here and maybe have a bit of influence in the king's court myself. And yet, check this out. We're looking at chapter 6, verse 12. And so, let's go from verse 11. And so Haman got the robe horse, he rode Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." The very next verse. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. There was no moment of lauding it. There was no moment of, oh, check me out in the robe. Mordecai had come from sackcloth and ash, had been elevated to great heights, second only to the king. And yet the very next thing that he does, because he's not preoccupied with what does the world think of me, he goes straight back to the king's gate, where he was mourning and crying for his people, crying out to God, seeing what was happening with Esther. And he goes back to that because he's more preoccupied with what God thinks than what anyone else thinks. And that is what humility looks like. We see that the focus is on Haman, and Haman gives us such a great definition of pride, but the counterbalance and God's unseen hand in all of this gives us a great definition of humility as well. So pride, Haman and pride, led to his destruction, and you'll probably hear more about that when Karen brings us her talk next week. But Mordecai showed the greatest of humility, and it saved him. It saved his people. And you know, if you tuned in to Beth's talk last week, and if you've missed any of the talks, go back and go. You can rewatch them again on our YouTube channel. But last week she talked about being dangerous for God, and it was interesting. I'd never really grasped the fact that Haman and his humility was dangerous. His humility put him in a place of potential death. And yet, he wasn't bothered by what other people thought. His humility led him to go, God, what do you think? Because you see me and you know me. So may we be dangerous with humility as well. So why do we need to know all this? What does it matter that God shows us what pride looks like there and shows us what humility looks like in Mordecai? Well, because if you're anything like me, I wrestle with pride all the time. Even in small little ways where little insecurities creep in and that question gets spoken over me. What does the world think of you? What would the world think of you if they knew how you felt right now? And I keep having to recheck myself to go, no, what does God think of me? Because if we don't, like Haman, pride will destroy a little piece of us. It will stop us living in the fullness of life that Jesus has intended for us and Jesus died for us to have. In that moment, like me and the person who was checking if I was all right and I was a little bit lonely, actually, my pride took hold and killed an opportunity for me to connect. And we're made for connection. It killed an opportunity for a relationship with people around me. But similarly, it can also, like we see with Haman to a large degree, it can kill any relationship that we might have with God as well. Pride. Actually, he did it so much that he put himself in a position where he was trying to level himself as a God. He was as far from God as he could possibly be. But I want to encourage you this morning, if you're struggling with pride this morning, pride to just show how you're feeling, show where you're in difficulty, and there are things that actually have a hold of you. And believe me, we all struggle with pride at some point. Pride is almost the undergirded foundation of what sin looks like in our lives. So if you've ever sinned and we all fall short of God's glory, then there's probably been pride in there at some point. If you're struggling with pride this morning, let me encourage you that you don't need to worry about what the world sees in you or knows in you or anything like that, because God sees you. God knows you. And in his eyes, you're enough. And so the two questions that we can use just as soft markers to see where we're at. What does the world think of us? And what does God think of us? Which one are we leaning towards this morning?